Welcome to the podcast from Multifaith Matters. I'm your host, John Moorhead, and we hope you enjoy today's podcast as always. Whether you are listening to it in audio form or watching on video via our YouTube page. And of course, this is not the only resource we have. We have lots of other podcasts with guests and topics of conversation. We have recommended articles and books and consulting services and all kinds of things. And all of this is designed to help Christians not only be concerned about fulfilling the Great Commission to share our faith with others, but also the great commandments of loving God and loving our neighbors, and in this context, loving our multi-faith neighbors. So we have conversations between people of different religious traditions to help us understand it. We also talk about religion and popular culture and what's going on in America's changing religious landscape. And that's what we're going to be doing today. And as we talk about the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those people who say they have no religious affiliation in various surveys like that from Pew. My guest is Elizabeth Drescher, and I'm going to read a bit of her bio so that we can get to know her. Elizabeth Drescher's research, teaching, and writing focuses on religion, spiritual and non-religion as it is practiced by ordinary people in the context of everyday life. She holds a PhD in Christian spirituality from the Graduate Theological Union and an MA in Roman Catholic systematic theology from, golly, I should have read this, Duquesne? Help me with that. I'm sorry. Very good. Thank you. University. Dr. Drescher is the author of Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of America's Nuns, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Tweet If You Heart Jesus, Practicing Church in the Digital Reformation, and co-author with Keith Anderson of Click to Save, the Digital Ministry Bible, and Click to Save Reboot. In addition to academic essays and book chapters on lived religion in America, she has published popular articles on American religious and spiritual life, new media and religion, and the challenges of religious leadership in America. The Atlantic Wire, Alternet, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury News, Religion Dispatches, Christianity Today, Sojourners, and other national publications. From 2012 to 2014, she was a journalism fellow on the Social Science Research Council's New Directions in the Study of Prayer initiative, and has received funding from the Wabash Center, the Teagle Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, and other organizations for research, teaching, and writing on contemporary religious and spiritual life. Elizabeth, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for your work. I've enjoyed a lot of your articles that I've seen online, particularly Religion Dispatches, as you unpacked the nuns, and your book, Choosing Our Religion. For me, as a scholar, also trying to work with practitioners, trying to understand America's changing religious landscape, I find this a fascinating and challenging time to be studying how America is changing. And I'm sure you join me in that. As we talk about the nuns, what are we talking about? How are they defined?
Well, the term nun is really a sociological term. It doesn't specifically apply to religion, although that's become its popular culture use in the last decade as more research came out on people who were asked with what religious group they identify or prefer or are affiliated. And they had the whole list of Christian denominations and other religious groups and no religion. And so those who said none, I don't affiliate with any religion, I don't prefer any religion, came to be identified as nuns. So it's really conventionally in academic terms, it's really kind of a remainder group.
Does the question itself, the way it's framed, does that still kind of reflect our biases and assumptions about Christianity and religion being about belief and those kinds of things?
Well, it can. A lot of the research that Pew has done, and they've started to shift this in the last 5 or 6 years, but really focused on belief issues. So do you believe in God or a higher power or cosmic life force? And even those terms have shifted over time. Gallup, which tends to be on the more conservative end of the spectrum, asks, do you believe in God or not? So they have only recently started moving into higher power, and then Pew's moved into life force. The General Social Survey, which is the federal government survey of social and cultural factors in the United States that the University of Chicago administers, asks about religious affiliation. So are you affiliated with a particular institutional religious group, or do you have a preference, a religious preference? And they ask about attendance at worship service. So it really varies by group. But yes, for a really long time, the focus has been on belief fairly narrowly, and certain kinds of practice like attending worship service, studying scripture, praying, and other kinds of practices that may not encompass all of the things that people do within the context of what they would think of as their spiritual lives.
They're a sizable group and they've been growing for a while. What kind of numbers are we talking about, and how does it compare, for example, to other religious groups in America?
Well, nuns are now, if they were, and they're by no means are, but if they were one religious denomination or group, they'd be among the largest. They make up about 25, 26 to 30% of the population, depending on the survey you're looking at overall, and generally of greatest anxiety to people in religious groups, Christian and otherwise. Among adults age 18 to 34, they make upwards of 40% of the population. So it's a pretty dramatic increase since in the last, say, 10 years. I think Pew found in 2007 that about 15%, 15 or 16% of the population identified as nuns. That was a big uptick from the 1990s, when it was generally 9, never into the double digits. So over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen really rapid growth among the religiously unaffiliated, or the non-religious, the nuns, especially among younger people.
Now, out of all the things you could have studied as a scholar in the area of religion, what is it that drew you to the nuns? I mean, I've always found so-called marginalized religious expressions more interesting than the mainstream. It helps me, being a part of the mainstream helps keep me honest. But what is it that drew you to study the nuns?
Being an academic is a second career for me. I came
Okay.
into academia from the corporate world, and that's sort of a long story transition. But one of the questions that drew me into the study of religion in my own life and in general was, an interest in how ordinary people coped with the moral and spiritual challenges in their everyday lives. And so I've always really been interested in how are people doing this. And I knew just from my experience in the corporate world that there were lots of those, both feelings of being morally compromised and feelings of the work that I and colleagues were doing, not having a sense of meaning and purpose in the way that we might have liked. And so when I started studying religion and theology, I was interested in how people did that with within religious traditions, but also outside of it, and increasingly at the intersection of institutional and extra institutional or non-institutional religion and spirituality. I've just always been really interested in how people like you and me, ordinary people, make their lives work. And so that was really my interest.
Yeah. What kind of methodology did you use in this study?
I used a mixed methodology. So I began by analyzing the available data from Pew and the General Social Survey and other sources like that to look at patterns in the religious landscape and how they were changing. I also did focus groups and surveys with relatively diverse national cohorts of people in different parts of the country in terms of of focus groups. So I was getting the East Coast and the West Coast, liberal areas, uh, on both coasts, and in the Midwest, and in the traditional Bible Belt, in focus groups. And then I did a broad survey of people to understand what they consider to be spiritually meaningful practices. And based on that, I developed a pool of people from whom I drew a little more than 100 people that I interviewed across the country, literally from Maine to Maui. I visited every census region in the United States to get a representative sample of people who had participated in the surveys I had done or been referred to me through that work. So I was trying to get a lot of different layers.
This question is probably going to be very complex. Unlike what I see a lot of times in media reporting, the assumptions are that the nuns largely represent an uptick in the number of atheists. So people are just rejecting religion and spirituality altogether. But who are the nuns, and what is the relationship between? There has been some increase in people who would claim to be atheist and agnostic, but is that the major story, or who are they? What's the diversity that makes up the nuns?
Yeah, I mean, probably about, and it's increased, about 4 or 5% of people in the United States, according to Pew, identify formally as atheist or agnostic. Now, for a long time, Pew didn't distinguish that category, so you couldn't really, those two categories. We know that within the agnostic group, there are some folks who are hard agnostics. They're kind of pretty much atheists, but they're hedging their bets and kind of keeping the question open. And there are other people who are agnostic, but they're genuinely curious. So there's some flexibility within those groups, but generally that's about 4 or 5% of the population. That's doubled over the last 30 years or so. So there's been a sizable growth in that. But the bulk of the people who identify as non-religious or nuns, about between 15 and 20%, depending on the data set, identify as nothing in particular or having no preference. So it doesn't mean that, and they have a range of, they do a range of practices that look pretty religious-y to those of us who are familiar with those, and they may espouse beliefs that sound pretty religiously and often, pretty specifically Christian, even if they don't define them in that way. So within that broader category of the 15 to 20% or so of nuns who identify as nothing in particular, it really is just a smorgasbord of, if we can imagine a time when we actually weren't frightened by smorgasbords, but of approaches to religiosity and spirituality.
Is it fair to say that the nuns can be understood as those who are dissatisfied with institutional forms of religiosity and identifying with that, and they're instead seeking more of an individual questing, seeking kind of orientation?
Not so much.
Okay.
I would say not so much. So lots of people are probably familiar with Robert Bella's work, which identified this character Sheila, who was a nurse who said she had kind of created her own religion. And Bella and colleagues, coined this phrase Sheilaism as this kind of individualistic, personal, fairly narcissistic, self-referential kind of boutique spirituality. Even with Sheila, that character, Sheila was a nurse. She helped people. That was her day job. And a lot of the work that she did spiritually was arguably to sustain her in being able to do that care work. So it was actually less individualistic and narcissistic than Bella and colleagues identified. And I found among the people that I interviewed and surveyed that some of them were alienated from institutional religion. Some of them had never really been a part of institutional religions. And some of them had continuing relationships with institutional religions. They just didn't um, affix a personal identity in relation to them in the way that I might say I'm an Episcopalian, or you might say an evangelical. Um, they just didn't do that. What I found overall was that relationships, personal relationships with family, friends, and community often defined the spiritual practices of the religiously unaffiliated. And so they often can appear individualistic um, because people articulate them in very personal terms. But when I ask people to really talk about the things that they do to cultivate or nurture their spirituality, however they define that, and that's a range as well, they talked about doing things either personally in order to enable them to better be in relationship with others, or through relationships in order to nurture their own spiritual well-being.
You touched on it a little bit in that response there, but maybe you could flesh it out a little bit. What kinds of journeys are people taking that lead them to become nuns? Are there any common factors, or is there a lot of diversity there?
There is, and I should say, I published Choosing Our Religion in 2016, and was doing that research for about 5 years before that. So we're 10 years out from that data pool, um, and when I look now, for example, at my undergraduate students at Santa Clara University, they're very different people than the people that I interviewed. The people that I interviewed are their parents or elder siblings. So we've seen some shifts over time. And so the journeys that people are on depend on the starting place. When the early U.S. religious landscape and Pew reporting came out in about 2007, 2008, that showed this big uptick in the non-religious, in the nuns. The bulk of that population were people who had been in a religious community or had been raised in one, at least nominally, generally Christianity, and they had left that. And so both the kind of religious community they were in and the circumstances of their leaving shaped how they came to identify as nuns. And so I saw among the population that I identified, the majority of whom had come from Christian backgrounds, that people who came from mainline Protestant backgrounds that tended to be more progressive, both in their theologies and in their social practices, often didn't have a lot of, angst or hostility about the religion. They just kind of got it. They were bored with it. They'd been there, did that. Love your neighbor. I'm good. I can go. So I saw, the people I talked to, or who talked to me actually, telling stories about, like I loved youth group. I had fun in the choir or whatever, but then I just didn't need to do it anymore. I grew up out of it. So that was a pretty common pattern among Catholics who participated in my study. There was a lot of hurt. They actually felt more pushed out of the tradition than having left it, whether that happened because of perceived sexism, lack of opportunities for women in religious leadership. The clergy abuse crisis, of course, had, as I was doing the research, really come into the public realm. And although none of the people that I interviewed had been directly personally impacted by that, they were aware of it and they were scandalized by that, or they had different um, um, perspectives on social issues than the Catholic Church. Largely, they were failures of community. They just didn't feel like the structure supported them. So there was a lot of, I talk in Choosing Our Religion about, mainline Protestants having been bored out of their churches, Catholics having been kind of hurt, wounded out of their churches. And among evangelical Protestants, they were the most angry group. The active cussers in my interviews were almost all evangelical Protestants or Mormons who felt like their traditions had lied to them about facts in the world, about science, about evolution, about social issues, and just a range of things that they felt like they were being told untruths, and that there were failures in leadership. So they tended to be the angriest group. They felt they often felt like they came from churches that professed really strong values, and truth and honesty were among that. And they saw a lot of hypocrisy in leadership, but also untruth in their representations of the realities in the world. So there were, kind of a range. Everybody didn't, there was some overlap in that. Of course, that's not a hard and fast typology. I just want to point out, though, now and I'm just gearing up in the next year to do another study related to this. Among my undergraduates who are between 18 and 22, generally, I'm seeing, first of all, far more of them who have come from families that were religious. So their starting point is not a religious tradition that they have left, but just having never had that as an important phenomenon. They may be even second generation non-religious, where I've noted, I survey my students every quarter just to know them in religious terms. But as I track on that, I'm starting to see students who talk about having had grandparents where one of the grandparents was very religious and one not, or some combination of that. And then the parents are less religious and then not religious, and they are not religious at all. And so what I'm seeing among young adults today, and mind, I teach in a religiously affiliated university. I teach in a Catholic university. So, but I've seen that when I started teaching there 11 years ago, about 80% of my students identified as religiously affiliated, mostly Catholic, but a lot of Protestant. Now that's down to about 40% in religion classes. So the idea of a journey, the kind of Robert Fuller seeking person that was characteristic of the boomers sort of coming out of the 1960s and 70s, is, I think, less typical of the unaffiliated today than it would have been a generation ago or two.
Interesting. The audience for this podcast is probably largely conservative evangelical. My hope is that we can be self-critical and open to the kinds of journeys that are taking place and the perceptions that these folks have of our church culture and church community. A follow-up to that, they said that if I understand it correctly, they said that the evangelical church was portrayed as a community where one could seek out truth and this kind of thing, and yet they weren't finding that. Would you say that the perception, or maybe you did some follow-up research in this area, was the perception that there was no room to ask questions, to express doubt about what they were teaching, and they were just supposed to, here's the truths we want you to accept without question, and there was no room for any kind of skepticism or searching and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there was a pattern, first of all, of, and I'm thinking of in particular one person I identified who was a really bright young man who had, gotten really involved in developing video games with some evangelical game developers, real sciencey kind of kid, had been homeschooled, and had been, taught that had been taught creation theory, and and been taught, that evolutionary theory was entirely false, and comes to find out when he leaves home to go to college that there are other views on that story.
Mhm.
And so he felt, not just that he couldn't question the truths that were presented to him, that was certainly true, but also that what was presented as true was false when he was able to see other evidence. And so there were kind of two layers. And he was probably the most extreme in this viewpoint, but I did see it generally across evangelicals and people who came from the LDS tradition. The sort of sense of there are unalloyed truths, and we don't question or challenge them. And when those fall apart, the level of betrayal on that is profound. It's profound in that people feel both that there's not space to explore, and I know this varies across evangelical traditions, but there was not space to explore those questions, and or that questions came with elaborate apologetics responses that really didn't weren't evidence based in the sense that we would use in a scientific assessment today. So there's a sense of just, I didn't get that, people lied to me. I mean, I heard that a lot. They lied to me, and they were hypocritical about it. So there was just sort of this sense of not being able to trust the adults in your life, who are really bringing you into relationship with a community, with a set of values, and that connects to the being that you consider to be divine. And so that really, for a lot of evangelical Protestants who talked with me, that really was an almost an unrepairable breach in trust, that not only damaged their relationship with their faith tradition, but with their families and friends and communities. So it was a more pervasive sense than that. There's another researcher, Josh Packard, who's at, I want to say, the University of Northern California, or Northern Colorado rather, who has identified this group of people he calls duns, who are people who have been wounded by the church. I think he did a follow-up book called Church Refugees, who sees people, sees a subset of the nuns in evangelical Protestant traditions who are disappointed with their churches, but not lost to the tradition. The people who talked to me tended to be not, they were done, but they were just done with a capital done.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially you're mentioning not only evangelicals, but Mormons. I've been involved in Mormon evangelical dialogue and Mormon studies, and it would seem that both traditions want to proselytize each other. They both critique each other's understanding of history and science, and yet they both have folks who are within those traditions who have left because of what they see as problems and shortcomings in those areas. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic how they kind of mirror each other in that regard.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the 4 F's of contemporary spirituality that you have in your book. What kinds of practices are the nuns finding meaning in as they orient their lives?
Yeah, so in the early survey that I did, I asked people, I had done a bunch of focus groups to identify things that people found spiritually meaningful, and then I did some early surveying to kind of cull that down, and then I tested a broader survey that was a national survey that went out to people to ask them to rank the things that they found spiritually meaningful. And what was really interesting for me about the results of that survey was that The survey went out to a wide range of people who were religiously affiliated and unaffiliated. At the time, about 20% of the population identified as nuns, and that's about the size in my study who were in my survey who were nuns. And among both groups, the religiously affiliated and the religiously unaffiliated, when I asked them to identify the things that they found most spiritually significant or meaningful or fulfilling in their lives, they said spending time with family, spending time with friends, preparing and sharing food, and spending time with pets and other animals. So I identified those as the 4Fs: family, friends, food, and Fido. What was interesting about them was that was the top of the list for both groups, because the religiously affiliated tend to be more often to be married and to have kids. They tended to like time with their pets a little more than time with their family. Um, and the unaffiliated spent more time with their friends than with their family. But they were still at the top. And the only conventional religious practice that was in the top 10 was prayer, which is, of course, the kind of mobile technology of religion. You can do it anywhere, you can do it alone, you can do it with others, and you don't have to follow a formula for it. So the other things that had been the conventional measures that researchers had studied, belief in God or a higher power, cosmic force, attending worship, studying scripture, taking adult education classes, and or church ed classes, things like that, were at the bottom of the list for both groups. That they were, even when people talked about things in a worship service that they found meaningful or fulfilling, whether it was, sacramental parts of it or music or things like that, the worship services, the more institutionalized practices were at the bottom of the list in terms of what felt spiritually fulfilling or meaningful for people.
One of the stereotypes I think evangelicals have is that unless you believe in God and things like the Ten Commandments, and you're not an ethical person, you can't have an ethical life. And yet the nuns are living out their own set of ethics. What kinds of sources are they tapping into as they construct their ethical lives?
Well, certainly, I talk about it in the book. There are a lot of specific, popular culture, Oprah-y sources that people rely on. But more generally, I saw people tapping into what ethicists would call an ethics of care, an understanding of a framework for moral action that emerges from, and this is through the work of people like Virginia Held and Nell Noddings and Carol Gilligan, that emerges from primary relationships. They would have said the mother and child relationship is the template for this, but it goes broader than that. Primary relationships with family members, close friends, community members that teach us how to care for one another, not in an abstract sense of having particular virtues, but of actually doing the labor of caring for people. So being compassionate, being empathetic, being generous, being self-sacrificing, making efforts toward both self-care and care of others, sufficient self-care that we are able to care for others, so that we have healthy families and friendship relationships and communities. And so among the nuns that I interviewed, while they never said I have an ethic of care, they talked a lot, often through the lens of the golden rule, but about practices of care for others as central to their moral foundation and their moral practices in the world. And that's very different than an ethics that's grounded in certain religious rules like the Ten Commandments, or religious virtues versus vices, as in virtue ethics that are a big part of the Catholic tradition. It really is a more organic, we learn how to be good people by caring for the people around us. So that was, I think, the pervasive ethical framework for the non-religious.
One of the things that has been interesting and challenging for me in watching the nuns has been the response of conservative Christian pastors and congregations. I've seen some articles kind of downplaying the significance and saying, well, we don't really need to worry about it. These were nominal believers anyway. They didn't have much grounding. And so now the only ones that are left are the deeply committed, or, we just need to design another evangelism program or the right worship service or what have you. Do you have a feel in your research for how well conservative Christian congregations understand this phenomenon and whether or not they really are equipped to address? I see this as a significant change in the religious landscape that will have deep ramifications for how churches promote their spirituality and do community and things like that. Are they taking it seriously? Are they equipped for it?
I can't say that I've studied evangelical or conservative congregations per se, but I can say, to kind of go back to this ethics of care. When I asked non-religious people, what are the spiritual or moral exemplars that you have in your life? Who are the people who influence you and help you spiritually? In history, or in wisdom texts, or whatever. I was really surprised that a large proportion of the people that I interviewed pointed to the Jesus of the Gospels. I was actually kind of shocked by that.
Yeah.
And the parable of the Good Samaritan came up over and over and over. And if anywhere in the Christian tradition there is an explicit ethic of care, it is that. Right, this ethic of neighbor love that transcends. Right, this is a kind of a core Jesus-y thing. Transcends even familial love. Right.
Right.
So that kind of sense of how do we learn to care and act as a practice in the world in terms of care. And this goes back to the shift that I'm seeing among my students as well. We know this summer that the United States was on fire around racial justice. Young people have been animated with concern about care for the earth, and we know this has been a huge issue within evangelical Christianity, the idea of care for the earth. And so I think that it's not so much that Christian traditions don't have practices and beliefs that can be compelling to people who are non-religious. It's that they have, and not just Christians, all religions have tended to hold them within institutional frameworks that make the church proper, the built church, the place down the road that you go to on Sunday or Wednesday night for Bible study or whatever you do, the place where you do your spirituality, even if you pray at home or whatever else you might do. And I think part of the shift that we're seeing spiritually, and again, for the people I interviewed, that meant a lot of things. Sometimes that referred to a divine spirit or a cosmic spirit in the supernatural way that Christians would mark as God. Sometimes it meant the human spirit and how to elevate the human spirit and its connectedness. But there's been, I think, a shift to cultivating the spirit in a way that nurtures personal piety or goodness, things that very much come out of Reformation Protestantism, right, to a wider systemic sense of caring for the goodness of the world, the well-being of the world. And so I think to the extent that churches of any sort, religions of any sort, can tap into that, and we have seen this. We saw it in the civil rights movement. Black Lives Matter envisions itself as a spiritual movement, although there's tension between people who understand that spirituality religiously and secularly. It still sees itself in many ways, and certainly Patrisse Cullors has talked about this, as a movement that's grounded in cultivating, nurturing, and elevating the spirit through action in the world. So to the extent that religions are engaged in the world and are sites where people can prepare themselves to act in the world through appropriate self-care and self-transcending care for others, they have a real place in the world. And in fact, one of my concerns, as I've, every time something that troubles me in the world happens, I think, oh gosh, where is the institutional structure that is going to help people to act in the world in the way that churches have done, despite all of their many, many faults for centuries? Where is that institutional structure going to come from? It doesn't function in government in that way. It doesn't function in popular culture in that way. So it seems to me that there's a robust infrastructure, even if it's flawed, that can connect to people's desire to do good in the world, to heal the world. That I think the non-religious and religious nuns are interested in, can be engaged with. Are they going to identify with, the Church of Saint Whatsit? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
But that identification is probably less important. This is my theology, is less important than how they act in the world.
Right. Well, I think that's encouraging for churches that still want to try and make an impact and listen and have some kind of interaction with these folks. Last question for you is ask you to speculate here, particularly as you're getting ready to do some new research. Where do you think the nuns are going? Are they gonna continue to grow? Is this an earthquake moving through the American religious landscape? What kinds of thoughts do you have about the future?
I I don't know if it's an earthquake, but the plates are shifting. I think that's true. I think that we've seen over the last 50 years a shift in people's valuing of institutions overall. I don't think it means that that there's sort of an anarchy of, people want no institutions. There's a distrust of institutions, certainly on both conservative and progressive ends of the spectrums, but there's also new commitments to institutionalization in healthier ways. So I don't know what that's going to look like. But this thing about this last generation and a half of non-religious people who are coming out of non-religious backgrounds does begin to shape a different way of caring for others and caring for the world in relationship to institutions. And we really just don't know what that's going to look like. We just don't. So I wish I would be at my comfortable research center in Maui if I had the answer to that for sure. And if I find it, I'll let you know. So you can tell people to pay me tremendous consulting fees or something like that, but I don't. I think we're in this moment where the plates are shifting, and it's probably going to take another 20, 30, 50 years to see where it all shakes out.
Yeah. I appreciate your willingness to try and speculate for me. And if you do get that research facility in Maui, if you need an associate or even a custodian, I'd be more than happy to help.
Yeah, I'm always saying to people, I feel like Hawaii overall, this is true, is wildly understudied, and I would be happy to be a scholar on the ground there at least half of the year to make that happen. So if I figure out a way to fund that, I will certainly let you know.
There you go. Multi-Faith Matters always needs a Maui office, so that'd be great.
That's true. Who does not?
That's right.
Who does not?
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much again for making time for coming on the podcast. Folks can find your bio and links to the book we've been talking about, choosing our religion, as well as the other work that you've been doing. And I look forward to following your additional research. So thank you so much for being here.
Alrighty, thank you. Have a great day.
Sure. Again, this is the podcast for Multifaith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead. Please rate the podcast wherever you listen to it. Subscribe on the YouTube page. And if you find this work that we're doing, we are a nonprofit. If you find it helpful, please consider a one-time donation or maybe ongoing support to keep this podcast going. Thank you so much for watching and listening.